Hi friends, welcome back to HanksterHears. I'm your host Ashley, and I couldn't be happier to be here with my husband, our special guest today, to share our family story with you. As the title and thumbnail say, this video is meant to help you, guide you, and inspire you along the journey of supporting a child with hearing loss.
We're proud parents of a little boy named Henry, we call him Hankster, who has severe to profound hearing loss and cochlear implants. Ash has been a cochlear implant recipient for about 30 years, and I have normal hearing. There aren't too many families with this unique perspective. We thought it might be helpful to share our story.
We'll take you through how we found out about Henry's hearing loss and how we felt when we got that initial diagnosis and the journey since then, and some fun facts here and there. By the way, do you hear a toddler shrieking in the background? That's Hankster.
That's Hankster, and his grandmother is playing with him downstairs. Yeah.
It's keeping it real.
Yeah.
When we received Henry's hearing loss diagnosis, how did you feel? Were you surprised by anything?
I was surprised because we had always been told that there was a very low chance of the hearing loss that you have being genetic and being passed on to a kid.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, neither of us have family history of hearing loss, except for me when I was 9 months old. And yeah, my family was counseled that I would have a very low chance of passing it on, even if it was genetic. So when we were expecting, we didn't think twice about having a baby with hearing loss. But when we first found out, it was during the newborn hearing screening when he was just a day old, not even a day old, and the technicians decided to repeat the screening because he didn't pass the first time, repeated it the second day, and he did not pass that time either. So we were referred to the local children's hospital for an ABR test, which is a more diagnostic test. And that is when we found out, definitively that he had a severe to profound hearing loss. The genetic testings come a long way. Back when I was diagnosed over 30 years ago, there were only a couple of genes that you can test for hearing loss. And nowadays, there are well over 100, maybe even 200 plus different genes you can test for hearing loss. So it's amazing what parents and families have access to in terms of information and new genetic testing these days. Fun fact, universal newborn hearing screening isn't that old, and it's thanks to the work coming out of the University of Colorado Boulder for leading the country in implementing universal newborn hearing screening in hospitals. So when you detect hearing loss early, the child has significantly more opportunities to develop on track with their peers. And there's so much to be said for early intervention programs, which are usually state funded and also funded by nonprofit organizations. And in our case, we received support from a speech language pathologist, a sign language teacher, and obviously an audiologist in our care team on the clinical side. But we have benefited from amazing clinicians and therapists and teachers of the deaf, and we couldn't be more grateful for that. The big takeaway here, according to research, is that children have access to early intervention by 6 months old. They have a much higher chance of developing normally on par with their peers. My own hearing loss was diagnosed when I was 9 months old, and I received a cochlear implant when I was 3, and by age 8, I was solely reliant on listening and spoken language. Rewind to the ABR tests, and when we received the initial hearing loss diagnosis, what was going through your mind at that point?
It was surprising since we weren't expecting it. And then, of course, it's terrible news to get. And no parent wants to hear that your kid has a hearing loss. For me, however, I was very fortunate in that I had the example of you and the amazing outcome that you've had with a cochlear implant. So that I was familiar with what Henry's outcome could look like. I remember thinking, wow, I'm so grateful that I have this example, and also thinking how difficult it must be to be a parent who gets this news for the first time without having the example that I had of someone who has a hearing loss and a cochlear implant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. And thinking back to when I was first diagnosed when I was 9 months old, over 30 years ago, my parents had
Right.
no example. They had literally no points of reference to look to as far as success stories of kids growing up in the mainstream hearing world, and let alone with the cochlear implant, especially because, for example, I was part of the first generation of young children to be implanted in the country. And when I received my cochlear implant, it had just been approved for kids under 18 in the US and within the last year. So it was a huge leap of faith. Whereas, so that was over 30 years ago. And fast forward to today, that generation is now in their early 30s, early to mid 30s, and we've had careers and decades of living with cochlear implants under our belts.
We talked about my reaction, which was pretty straightforward, but let's talk about your reaction, which was a little more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I shared in my last video, I struggled with feelings of guilt and self-blame, especially at the beginning when we found out about Henry's hearing loss. And from my perspective as an adult with hearing loss, I have profound hearing loss, and I have a cochlear implant. I know what it's like to walk that road and navigate the world, build a career and build friendships, build my social circle, and travel and have relationships and find you and get married and all of that. And so there are challenges along the way, and looking back at what I overcame, and to the point to be able to rely on just listening and spoken language, there's a lot that goes into it, and there's a lot to be proud of. I knew that Henry had that road ahead of him, and that led to feelings of guilt. But what really helped was the amazing support that we received from family, from close friends, and our amazing clinicians and therapists, and the team and the village that we built around us.
So the question of why did we choose cochlear implants for Henry? And the answer for me obviously is straightforward. It's because of you. The more complicated answer is that because of the degree and severity of the hearing loss, Henry was most likely a cochlear implant candidate. And so I remember when we got the ABR test, my first reaction was, well, let's get him hooked up with cochlear implants.
Yeah, exactly. And we knew that would be around 9 months old. That's the youngest a child can be implanted in the US. There he is. But leading up to that, we were advised to get him outfitted with hearing aids on both ears, regardless of the severity of his hearing loss. And so in one ear he has a severe hearing loss, and the other one is severe to profound. So what was amazing, and what we learned a lot through this process, but even with hearing aids, they amplified sound, the acoustic hearing, so well, or relatively speaking, in his context, that he was able to imitate certain speech sounds like ah, ooh, ee, shh, and the different lang sounds. And we worked with an amazing speech language pathologist and auditory verbal therapist, and still work with her to help Henry make sense of sound. But when he had the hearing aids, we built a sound play box of different toys representing those different speech sounds, so we would help his brain develop those auditory pathways, which is really important leading up to the cochlear implant surgery. So in that box, for example, for the speech sound ah, we had an airplane. You go ah with the airplanes, so it's all like play based. And then there's an owl, and you go hoo 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 hoo, or ooh ooh ooh, so that ooh sound. And
the mouse was E,
yeah,
the snake was S, and a little shaker was SH or
yeah, exactly. So with the hearing aids, he was able to imitate and reproduce those sounds, and even with us narrating and bringing our world to life by when we go up the stairs, every time we say up, 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 and then when you go down the stairs, you go down, and it just becomes routine and part of our fabric, our daily fabric, to the point where he said the word up or a variation of that when he was 6 or 7 months old with hearing aids. It's amazing. But the big takeaway here is leading up to the cochlear implant surgery with that consistency, it really helps the surgery, recovery, and therapy once the child gets activated. So after the activation, we were able to play with those toys, and because those auditory pathways have been created, even though the sound sounded different when he had just hearing aids versus when he had his cochlear implants on, he was able to make that connection.
He was able to associate the sound based on the toys. So he saw the airplane and he knew that that's the ah sound. It sounds different now, but that's the ah sound. That's the snake that makes the S sound, so on and so forth.
Exactly. It's amazing. So for Henry to receive bilateral cochlear implants at 9 months old and the early intervention therapy that we're talking about in this video, he is on track to reach certain milestones around the same time as his peers in that same range. And I am so glad that we made the choice to have him receive cochlear implants at such a young age. You know, he has stereo sound versus I have one, so it's more one-sided, and it's all up from here.
Something that we didn't expect leading up to the surgery was that we would have to isolate for a period of time leading up to the surgery, because any sickness, even getting a cold, would require them to postpone the surgery. We wanted Henry to get implanted as early as possible, and so we didn't want to have it postponed by any period of time just because he got sick. So that was difficult because we had to keep him at home from daycare.
We both work full time.
And we both worked full time, so we're having to juggle him at home for a couple weeks.
We couldn't even have help from family.
Right.
And because we were quarantining. It was,
yeah, and it was fine, but it was just a lot to have him at home, and then also we're being very careful. However, this was January 2022, and all of us ended up getting COVID, and the surgery got postponed anyway. So that was pretty unpleasant in the wintertime in Colorado when you want to see your friends and family.
exactly.
We had to keep to ourselves and keep them at home.
Yeah. So as far as the actual surgery goes, each ear was only about 40 minutes, and that was one of the reasons why we chose this particular surgeon and the care team around them. And for little kids, you want to minimize their time under anesthesia, especially babies. And we were blown away by how quickly and how efficiently the surgery was. It was completely outpatient. We didn't have to spend the night in the hospital. And what did the surgeon say when he came out after the surgery?
The surgeon told us, just be aware, he's going to look like a ping pong ball.
Yeah, that's right, with all the gauze.
And sure enough, he did. He was like a little Mario character with his white gauze, and he was wearing his red Christmas jumper, his like jumpsuit.
Yeah. This is soon after Christmas that year, and you're never prepared to see your baby covered in gauze and with bandages, but that came off after about a day, and he was able to be more comfortable after that. He had little stereo strips on these small incisions behind each ear, and that healed beautifully.
And he was back to acting normally within a day, I would say.
Oh, yeah.
So the only kind of freaky thing for us was that cochlear implant recipients after the surgery can have nosebleeds because the ear, nose, and throat is all connected, obviously. And so I remember seeing that on the discharge instructions. And then that night, we went in to check on him in the middle of the night, and his nose had been bleeding, and so there was blood all around his crib, and it was a freaky thing to turn the lights on. You see that.
So for anyone who's preparing for their child to go through CI surgery, just know that, and know that it's okay. And that was one big takeaway for us. So the time period between the CI surgery and activation was about 2 weeks, and Henry was not able to wear hearing aids. We actually retired them at that point. We are not supposed to put devices on him, and obviously he hadn't been activated yet. So we gave him a break from the hearing therapy and all the daily routine, but it was all about sensory play and books and some sign language, and it's just a time for everybody to take a beat before the big activation day. If you're curious how Henry's cochlear implant surgery and activation and recovery went, stay tuned for another video. I'll bring Ian back for that episode. So that's it for today's episode. We really hope it was helpful and insightful and inspiring, especially if you're a parent, family member, or a caregiver of a child with hearing loss.
If you're enjoying what we're sharing, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment.
Stay tuned. We'll have plenty of videos with experts and sneak peeks into our day-to-day life and much more.